What he does next. I was staring at the clock on my laptop when HR's number flashed across my phone screen. Michael, we need you to come in before the all-hands meeting, Janet from HR said, her voice carrying that practiced neutrality people use when they're about to detonate something. Asterisk, David wants to speak with you first. Asterisk, I'd been waiting for that call for 6 months. 6 months of 70-hour weeks. 6 months of skipped vacations, of turning down a competing offer because I genuinely believed in what I was building at Nexus Analytics. The VP of Operations role had been dangled in front of me since the previous quarter, and my direct manager, David, had personally told me the position was mine pending the board's formal approval. I'd already started making notes about restructuring the department. I straightened my tie, grabbed my coffee, and walked toward the executive floor with the quiet confidence of a man who thought he already knew how the conversation would end. I did not know how the conversation would end. David's office had a glass wall that overlooked the open floor plan below, and as I approached, I could see 2 people sitting across from his desk. David himself was behind it, looking everywhere except at the door. The other person, seated with the easy confidence of someone who already belonged, was a man I had never seen before. Young, sharp suit, the relaxed posture of someone who'd already been told good news. Then I saw her. Claire was sitting in the chair beside this stranger, and she turned her head at exactly the moment I pushed the door open. For 1/2 second, something flickered across her face. Not guilt. Not quite. More like the micro-expression of a person caught mid-sentence in a lie they haven't fully committed to yet. Claire was my girlfriend of 3 years. She was also the senior director of strategic partnerships at Nexus, 2 levels above me, which had never been a problem because we'd disclosed the relationship to HR at the start and our departments barely overlapped. She was brilliant, driven, and I had loved her with the kind of steady, certain love that doesn't announce itself dramatically. I had bought a ring 4 months earlier. It was sitting in the drawer of my nightstand. Asterisk, Michael, come in. Close the door. Asterisk, David said. I closed the door. I looked at the stranger. I looked at Claire. I sat down in the remaining chair because my legs had apparently decided to participate in the meeting without consulting the rest of me. I want to be straightforward with you, David began, which is exactly what people say immediately before they are not straightforward. Asterisk, the board has completed their review of the VP of Operations candidates, and we've made a decision. Asterisk, he gestured toward the stranger. Asterisk, this is Ryan Caldwell. He comes to us from Meridian Group, where he was director of operations for the Western Division. The board felt his experience in scaled logistics was the specific profile they wanted for where we're taking the company in the next phase. Asterisk. I heard the words. I processed them in that strange slow-motion way the brain handles information it flat out refuses to accept as real. Ryan will be starting in the role next Monday, David continued. Asterisk. We absolutely value your contributions, Michael, and we want to discuss a revised path forward for your career here. Asterisk. Asterisk, how long? Asterisk, I heard myself say. David blinked. Asterisk, I'm sorry. Asterisk. Asterisk, how long has this decision been made? Asterisk, I turned and looked directly at Claire. Asterisk, and why is the senior director of strategic partnerships sitting in on an internal HR discussion about operations staffing? Asterisk. The silence in that room had texture. I could feel it pressing against my eardrums. Claire kept her expression composed. That was what struck me. Not that she looked guilty, but that she looked rehearsed. I was consulted during the evaluation process, she said carefully. Asterisk, given our cross-departmental work. Asterisk. We don't have cross-departmental work, I said. Asterisk. Our teams have had exactly 2 joint meetings in the past year. Asterisk. Ryan Caldwell shifted in his seat. He had the decency to look slightly uncomfortable, which told me he understood more about the situation in that room than he was pretending to. David stepped in with the smooth deflection of a man who'd practiced corporate de-escalation. Asterisk. Michael, why don't we schedule time this week to talk about your trajectory? There are exciting things happening. Asterisk. And I stood up. Not because I was being dramatic. I stood up because sitting down in that chair had suddenly become physically impossible. I'll take that meeting, I said. Asterisk. But I'd like to understand the full picture first. Asterisk. I walked out. I made it to the elevator, pressed the button for the parking garage, and stood inside the descending metal box with my jaw locked, and my hands completely still at my sides. 3 years. I had known Claire for 3 years. I had met her at an industry conference in Denver and spent 4 hours talking to her at the hotel bar about supply chain optimization and emerging market analytics, which sounds completely insane but was genuinely the best conversation I had ever had. I had fallen in love with her intelligence first, the way her mind moved fast and precise and never wasted words. I had introduced her to my parents at Thanksgiving. I had rebuilt my entire 5-year plan around her. I had bought a ring, and she had just sat in that chair, composed and strategic and practiced, while someone else was handed the position she knew I had sacrificed 2 years of my life to earn. I sat in my car and watched the clock. Then I started thinking. I am not a man who breaks things or shouts in parking garages. I am not built for spectacular collapse. What I am built for, what I have always been built for, since I was the kid who read the rulebook before every board game and understood intuitively that information is power, is precision. When I am hurt, I go quiet. When I go quiet, I start paying attention to things other people assume I've stopped noticing. And the first thing I noticed was this. Ryan Caldwell was not a random external hire. I'd spent enough time in this industry to know that boards don't pull candidates from competitor firms in 3-week timelines unless someone already had a relationship with that candidate. The formal evaluation process David had referenced took 6 months when done legitimately. 6 months ago, I had been the only person under serious consideration for this role. That had been explicitly stated to me in writing. Something had changed in those 6 months. Something or someone. I pulled out my phone and texted my closest friend at the company, a senior analyst named Greg, who had been with Nexus since the beginning and knew where everybody was buried. I kept it simple. Asterisk, need to talk. Lunch today? Asterisk. His response came in 40 seconds. Asterisk, already heard. Yes. Noon. Not here. Asterisk. That response alone told me the situation was worse than I'd understood sitting in David's office. We met at a sandwich place 3 blocks from the office, the kind of completely unremarkable spot where corporate conversations go to disappear. Greg sat across from me with the expression of a man carrying something heavy. He was one of those people who genuinely cannot strategically lie if his career depended on it, which was both his greatest professional weakness and the exact reason I trusted him. Asterisk, how bad is it? Asterisk, I asked. He exhaled. Asterisk, how honest do you want me to be? Asterisk. Asterisk, Greg. Asterisk. Asterisk, Ryan Caldwell and Claire dated for 2 years before she came to Nexus. They broke up. She came here, built her career. He apparently reached out to her 6 months ago, and, asterisk, he stopped. Picked at his napkin. Asterisk, the two of them have been meeting outside the office. People have seen them. There are people on the executive team who know. The board approved this hire after she advocated for him, specifically, in a closed-door strategic planning session. Asterisk. The sandwich in front of me was untouched. I kept my eyes on Greg and my voice completely level. Asterisk. She's in a relationship with me. Asterisk. Asterisk, I know. Asterisk. Asterisk. She's been in a relationship with me for 3 years. Asterisk. Asterisk, I know, man. Asterisk, he looked genuinely pained. Asterisk. I should have told you sooner. I thought it was rumor. I didn't want to blow up your life over gossip. And then the hire got approved and I realized. Asterisk. It's not gossip, I said. No, he said. Asterisk, it's not. Asterisk. I paid for both our lunches. I thanked Greg, told him I'd need a few days, and drove home. I didn't go back to the office that afternoon. I called David's assistant, said I needed a personal day, and went home to the apartment I'd shared with Claire for 18 months. She wouldn't be back until evening. I used the time well. Betrayal does something specific to the human mind when the person carrying the most intelligence is also carrying the most pain. It doesn't scatter the thinking. It focuses it. Every single thing I'd ignored or explained away over the past several months began clicking into place with the terrible precision of a combination lock opening. The late nights she'd attributed to board prep. The weekend trip to San Francisco for a conference. I'd offered to join her and been gently discouraged. The subtle shift in her behavior around the time Ryan Caldwell had apparently re-entered her life. A slight increase in distance. A slight decrease in future tense conversation. She had stopped mentioning the vacation we'd planned for the spring. I had noticed and said nothing because I trusted her. By the time she walked through the door at 7:15, I had everything I needed. Not evidence of the affair. Not yet. That would come later. But clarity, the kind that settles in the chest like cold water and makes a person very, very calm. She set her bag on the counter. She read the room in approximately 1 second, because she was brilliant, and brilliance cuts both ways. Michael. Ryan Caldwell, I said. Asterisk, tell me from the beginning. Asterisk. She was good. Even then, even caught in that apartment with 3 years of shared life hanging in the air between us, she was strategically good. She started with minimization. They'd reconnected professionally. She genuinely thought his experience was a strong fit for the role. She had recused herself from the final decision. She layered it carefully, feeding me partial truths designed to preempt the full ones. I let her finish. Then I said, asterisk. I'm going to ask you one question, and I need you to understand that your answer determines how this next portion of our lives goes. Not whether we stay together. That's already been decided, but how this goes. Are you having an affair with Ryan Caldwell? Asterisk. The pause was approximately 4 seconds. In those 4 seconds, I watched the calculation move across her face, the assessment of what I knew, what I could prove, what would cost her least. Yes, she said. The words sat in the room like a physical object. Asterisk, how long? Asterisk. Asterisk, 5 months. Asterisk. Asterisk, you advocated for him to receive a position that you knew I was the internal candidate for. You used your access to the board to install your affair partner in a role that should have been mine. Yes or no? Asterisk. Another pause. Shorter this time. Asterisk, it's more complicated than yes or no. Asterisk. Asterisk, Claire. Asterisk. Yes, she said. Her voice had changed. The strategic composure was still there, but underneath it something else had appeared. Not guilt exactly. More like the look of someone who has just accepted that a particular game is over. Thank you, I said. Asterisk, you should start looking for a place to stay. I'll give you until the weekend. Asterisk. She stared at me. I think she had expected something louder, screaming, accusations, the kind of emotional explosion that people can negotiate with and shape. My quietness confused her, and her confusion was the first thing in the past 8 hours that had made me feel anything approaching satisfaction. I'm going to bed, I said. Asterisk. I have work to do tomorrow. Asterisk. I moved into the guest room. I lay on top of the covers, fully dressed, and stared at the ceiling and let myself feel every single thing I needed to feel. The grief of 3 years. The humiliation. The specific razor-edge betrayal of someone using your love as cover while methodically dismantling your career. I let it move through me like weather. Then I started making a list. Let me be clear about something. Revenge is a word that implies chaos, emotion, and impulsivity. What I engaged in was not revenge in that sense. It was correction. Claire had introduced a profound professional and personal injustice into my life using access and influence she had gained partly through her relationship with me. Correcting that injustice required the same tools she had used: information, access, and patience, deployed with significantly more precision. I started with documentation. Greg had mentioned that people had seen them together. I reached out carefully to 2 other colleagues I trusted, a woman named Patricia from legal, who had observed Claire and Ryan dining together at a restaurant 3 weeks earlier, and a former intern named James who had seen them in the parking garage on a Saturday. I didn't ask them to do anything dramatic. I asked whether they'd be willing to provide factual accounts of what they'd witnessed if formally asked. Both said yes. I then spent the following evening reviewing Nexus's corporate ethics policy, which I had read twice before for general familiarity, but now read with the focused attention of a lawyer preparing a brief. What I found was completely unambiguous. Senior directors were explicitly prohibited from using their positional authority to influence hiring decisions for candidates with whom they had personal or romantic relationships. The conflict of interest policy required disclosure and mandatory recusal from any related decision-making process. Claire had not only failed to disclose, she had actively participated in board advocacy for her affair partner while in a relationship with the internal candidate who would have otherwise received the position. This was not a gray area. This was a direct, documented violation of corporate governance policy. I filed a formal inquiry with the Nexus Ethics and Compliance Office, not with HR, which reported to the same executive structure Claire had already influenced, but directly with compliance, which reported to the board's audit committee. I was careful, precise, and entirely factual. I cited specific policy clauses. I named specific meetings. I attached a timeline. I didn't exaggerate. I didn't need to. While the compliance process began its work, I focused on the other dimension. Ryan Caldwell had started the following Monday with the smooth confidence of a man who believed his position was completely secure. I watched from a careful distance and noticed something important straight away. He didn't actually know the operations department. He knew the language. He deployed the right terminology in meetings. From a distance, he sounded credible. But I had spent 2 years building the institutional knowledge of that department's actual infrastructure, and gaps in his understanding revealed themselves within the first week to anyone paying close attention. I paid very close attention. I documented 3 specific instances in his first 10 days where his operational decisions were based on fundamental misunderstandings of how our systems actually functioned. And I wrote them up with the clean, factual brevity of someone creating a record. I CC'd the chief operating officer on each memo, professionally, respectfully, framed as flagging potential operational concerns during a leadership transition. Every single word was accurate. The COO's responses were carefully neutral, but he responded to all 3. That told me he was reading them. My attorney called on a Wednesday afternoon. I had retained her the day after the lunch with Greg, a sharp, unhurried woman named Dr. Angela Rhee, who specialized in employment discrimination and corporate ethics violations. She had reviewed my documentation with the same unsentimental precision I had assembled it, and her assessment was direct. What Claire had done potentially constituted tortious interference with my career advancement, particularly given the documented pattern of influence in a structured hiring process. She recommended we put Nexus on formal notice. The letter went out on a Thursday. It was addressed to the board's general counsel. It was 12 pages long. It referenced the ethics policy violations, the documented timeline of the affair, the advocacy in closed-door sessions, and the resulting material harm to my career trajectory. It requested a formal board review, reinstatement of my candidacy for the VP position, and a backdated compensation adjustment reflecting the period during which my advancement had been improperly impeded. By Friday afternoon, the board had convened an emergency session. I found this out from Patricia in legal, who told me with wide eyes that the general counsel had been in closed-door meetings since 11 a.m. and that the audit committee chair had flown in from New York. I thanked her. I went back to my desk and continued the operational analysis I'd been preparing for the COO. Meanwhile, Claire's world was accelerating toward a different kind of reckoning. She had underestimated something fundamental about the professional community in which she operated. She was brilliant and strategic, but she had made a strategist's classic error. She had optimized for her desired outcome without adequately modeling the downstream consequences. She had controlled the board's decision. She had not controlled the narrative. When people at Nexus learned, and they learned quickly because institutions leak, that the new VP of operations had been installed after a senior director advocated for him while conducting an undisclosed affair with him, the cultural response was severe. Our industry operates on a specific kind of professional currency, and Claire had spent hers in a single transaction. The colleagues who had respected her, the junior women in the company who had looked to her as a model of earned advancement, the peers who had supported her career. One by one, I watched the warmth drain from interactions I observed. She had done the thing that people in professional environments almost never forgive. She had used the institution for personal benefit and called it meritocracy. I didn't spread the information. I didn't need to. The compliance investigation, once initiated, involved interviews with multiple staff members. Those conversations happened. People talk. Ryan Caldwell lasted 6 weeks. He resigned on a Friday with a brief statement about pursuing other opportunities, which is corporate language for a conversation with general counsel that made continuing completely untenable. The 3 memos I had sent the COO formed part of a performance documentation file that had grown considerably in 6 weeks, supplemented by assessments from 2 department heads who had found his operational decisions genuinely costly. The compliance investigation had also by that point formally implicated the hiring process as tainted. His position had become a liability for the company, and companies ultimately prioritize their own protection. I was called into a meeting with the board chair and the COO on a Monday morning. The board chair, a direct, silver-haired man in his 60s named Franklin Howell, opened by acknowledging, in the careful language of institutions protecting themselves, that the hiring process for the VP of Operations position had been conducted improperly, and that this had resulted in material harm to my career standing at the company. He did not use the word affair. He did not mention Claire by name. He spoke in the clean, passive voice of corporate accountability. Then he offered me the position, not as a consolation, not wrapped in the apologetic softness of an institution doing the bare minimum to avoid litigation. He offered it with a salary 20% above the original number, a formal written acknowledgement of the process failures to be placed in my personnel file, and a direct reporting line to the COO that the previous version of the role had not included. I accepted. I shook his hand and the COO's hand. I thanked them both. I walked back to my office and stood at the window for a long moment, looking out at the city. And what I felt was not triumph. Triumph is too loud for what I felt. It was something quieter and more permanent, the feeling of a thing being set right. Claire resigned 3 days after Ryan. I don't know the specific content of her conversation with the board, but I know it was not voluntary in any meaningful sense. The compliance investigation had concluded that she had violated the conflict of interest policy in a material way, and that finding was now a formal part of the institutional record. Whatever arrangement she reached with the company's legal team, remaining in her role was not part of it. She called me once, 2 weeks after she had moved her things out of the apartment. I was at the office working late, genuinely working late, the kind I now did because I wanted to, because the work was mine and the title meant something, and the 50-hour weeks were building something real. I let the call go to voicemail. She said she needed to talk. She said she had made an enormous mistake. She said she had lost everything because of a decision she'd convinced herself was right and understood now was not. Her voice had a quality I had never heard in it before, stripped of the strategic composure, stripped of the practiced clarity, a rawness that I think was genuine. She said she was sorry. I listened to the voicemail twice. I deleted it. I didn't call back. This is the part one want to be honest about. I didn't feel nothing. I had loved her. The love doesn't evaporate because the person turned out to be different from who you believe they were. It lingers in the specific way of all genuine things, doesn't perform, doesn't announce itself, just sits there in your chest as a fact about who you were and what you gave. But love and trust are not the same thing. And trust, once deliberately dismantled, does not rebuild from a voicemail. I went back to work. The months that followed were, by almost any external measure, the most productive of my career. I restructured the operations department using the 2 years of institutional knowledge that Ryan Caldwell had never actually possessed. I identified 3 systemic inefficiencies in our logistics chain that the previous structure had obscured, and built remediation processes that the COO presented to the board in Q3 as a significant cost efficiency achievement. I hired 2 people who were exactly right for their roles, not impressive on paper in the way that looks good in a board presentation, but genuinely skilled in the specific ways the work actually required. And I gave them room to operate. I stopped working 70-hour weeks. Not because the ambition had dimmed, but because I now understood something I had been genuinely confused about before. 70-hour weeks are what you work when you're trying to prove something to someone. 50 focused hours built more than 70 anxious ones. And I was no longer interested in anxiety as a management strategy. When Greg and I had lunch most Fridays, he had been the person who told me the truth when telling the truth was deeply uncomfortable, and I don't take that lightly. I bought him a very good bottle of whiskey on the 6-month anniversary of the board meeting with a note that said simply, "Thank you for being someone I could trust." He texted me 3 laughing emojis. Then, on a separate line, "You earned this." I thought about the ring in the nightstand drawer occasionally, in the abstract way you think about a near miss. I had been so certain. Certainty, I've come to understand, is a feeling, not a fact. The feeling of certainty about a person doesn't mean you've seen the whole person. It means you've stopped questioning. I stopped making that mistake. I stopped confusing familiarity with knowledge. I met a woman named Elena at an industry roundtable in Chicago. She was a director of data infrastructure at a mid-sized firm in Austin, sharp and funny and fully comfortable with silence in a way I found immediately striking. We talked for 3 hours and exchanged cards. I texted her 2 days later. She responded with a warmth and directness that had none of the performed ambiguity I had come to associate with early-stage connection, and I appreciated that more than I can adequately explain. We took it slowly. I was honest with her about what the previous year had involved, not as a performance of vulnerability, but because she asked direct questions, and I have always answered those honestly. She listened without trying to manage my feelings about it, which was its own kind of gift. She told me about her own previous relationship, which had ended for different, but not entirely unrelated reasons, and we sat with the shared understanding of two people who have learned some genuinely expensive things and are no longer pretending those lessons didn't happen. She was nothing like Claire. This was not a criticism of Claire or a virtue of Elena. They were simply different people. And my love for Elena developed from the ground up, built on what I actually knew of her, rather than a version of her I had constructed from 3 years of evidence and the hope of a ring in a nightstand drawer. I heard about Claire intermittently through the network that professional communities inevitably sustain. She had landed at a smaller firm in another city. A step down in seniority. A significant step down in compensation. I heard this without satisfaction and without grief. It was simply information. The way a weather report from a city you no longer live in is simply information. I had also, somewhere in the course of those months, stopped thinking about Ryan Caldwell almost entirely. He had been a variable in someone else's equation, placed into my professional life by a decision I hadn't made. His subsequent failure in the role he'd been handed through influence rather than merit was not something I had orchestrated. The work had done that on its own, as work generally does. One evening in October, about a year after David had called me into that office, I was sitting at my desk after everyone else had gone home. Not anxiously, just finishing something I was genuinely interested in finishing. The city outside the window was doing what fall cities do, going golden and cooling and serious. My phone buzzed with a text from Elena. A photo of the Austin skyline at dusk, and the words, "Thinking of you." I looked at the photo for a moment. I thought about the ring that was no longer in the nightstand drawer. I'd returned it to the jeweler quietly, with no drama and no ceremony. I thought about the Tuesday morning when HR had called, and what I had expected the day to contain, and what it had actually contained. I thought about my father, who had told me once when I was 17 and had just lost a state championship in a way that felt catastrophically unfair. Asterisk, the only thing a man actually controls is what he does next, not what was done to him, not the outcome of someone else's choices. What he does next, asterisk. I had done the next things well. Not perfectly. I had carried more grief than I'd admitted to anyone, including myself, for longer than was probably useful. I'd had nights where the humiliation of it settled in hot and persistent and refused to be reasoned with. I'd questioned my own judgment about people in ways that occasionally made me overcautious and had to be walked back through deliberate effort. But the work was good. The team was strong. The woman in Austin sent photos of sunsets and asked about my day with genuine curiosity. The board chair had mentioned in a Q3 review that the operational improvements under my leadership had contributed to a revision of the company's 5-year growth projection. I texted Elena back. Asterisk, it's beautiful. Call you in an hour. Asterisk. She sent back a single word. Yes. I closed my laptop, straightened my desk, and walked out of the building into the October evening. The city was exactly what it was, real and ordinary and full of consequence. And I moved through it like someone who understood that the worst thing that had happened to him in recent memory had also, with patience and precision and a refusal to stay broken, become the beginning of the best period of his life. I never thought about Claire with longing again. The grief faded in the way grief does when it has been fully acknowledged and set down deliberately, rather than buried or performed. What remained eventually was something I hadn't expected. A clean kind of gratitude. Not for her, or for what she'd done, but for the clarity that follows when you've been forced to find out exactly what you're made of under pressure. I knew now. The ring drawer was empty. The position was mine. The work was real. That was enough. That was, in fact, everything.